Well, welcome everybody back to Planorama, and I hope you enjoyed episode 1, which covered the Lib Dem manifesto. It's time for a real change because we're covering the Labour manifesto today, Duncan Field and myself. So it was published yesterday. There's masses of information within it. I know, Duncan, you've spent a long time trying to winnow out everything to do with planning, infrastructure, environment, and that's what we're going to try and cover in less than 10 minutes today. So should we dive in relation to the pure planning changes which they're proposing? I mean, what did you...
Yes, I mean, the first thing which is noticeable is this concept of putting voices of local people at the heart of planning, which most of us probably think is already there, but I think it was probably picking up on their Land for the Many paper when they were talking about the community participation agency and really giving people much more local control, maybe even the idea of jury service for local plans, which would be interesting. But otherwise than that, they talk about rebalancing the system so local authorities have a bit more power and funding, in particular having the freedom to set planning fees. And I thought probably most importantly of all is a sort of cross-cutting theme. Many of us have asked what these declarations of climate emergencies from local authorities really mean. Well, in the Labour Party manifesto, they're suggesting that climate and environmental emergency has to be taken into account in all planning decisions. And so looks as if that's going to have either a policy or statutory footing. So that's really broadly the sort of pure planning piece.
So it doesn't sound, that aspect of it doesn't sound too radical. They're not, reshaping the system or making any reference to the idea of a statutory national planning framework or anything like that.
No. And actually, that point on climate environmental emergency, to some extent, let's be frank, probably helpful, because at the moment we have local authorities applying that resolution that they've made to planning issues without really having a firm policy basis for doing so. So
I think it's probably when we come on now to housing, and I was seeing that they were restating, the 1945 Labour Party pledge of providing an adequate home for all families in the country, and it was quite this is really one of the landmark parts of their proposals.
Definitely. I mean, housing is a very lengthy piece in the manifesto, and it's full of initiatives, some of which have been trailed already and some of which we mentioned on the last vlog. So the English Sovereign Land Trust, which is going to be set up to buy land cheaply for low-cost housing, public land not being sold off but used also for low-cost housing, a use it or lose it tax on stalled housing developments.
So the idea of a tax is different from what we've heard previously.
So not necessarily losing your planning permission, but just being taxed for not implementing. Brownfield first, Greenfield second, which isn't really that surprising. Tough new zero carbon standard on all new homes, and linked to that, upgrading the existing homes. They estimate 27 million homes to improve energy efficiency. They're committing to a build rate of 150,000 a year by the end of the Parliament, but that is just for council and social rent, and 100,000 of that will be council social rent. So I couldn't actually find a overall target in there. But
no, I couldn't. That seems really quite an interesting concept. I mean, how are they going to, I suppose it's a symbol of, the weight that they're attaching to social housing as opposed to housing provided by the market.
Yeah, it's all about affordability, I think, for them, and actually they've addressed the issue of how you define affordable, and they're going to link that to local incomes. A few other things to mention: an end to office to residential permitted development rights, an end to right to buy, which obviously is designed to preserve low-cost or rented housing stock. Local preference for housing, i.e. the first dibs policy that we've seen to roll out.
Yeah.
And a levy on overseas companies buying housing.
Right.
The only other thing to mention, I think, which got a lot of coverage in a conference I was at yesterday on housing in London, was the idea of private rent controls, both in terms of capping rents, limiting increases to CPI, and offering open-ended tenancies with an end to no-fault evictions. So, certainly they're interested in regulating the private rented sector as well.
Yeah. So, I suppose it's a practical question in all of this. I mean, there are some really significant changes being flagged there. I mean, come 13th December, Labour comes to power. I mean, what is going to happen in relation to the speed of change and the attitude that local authorities, particularly Labour-controlled authorities, are going to be taking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too much to expect there to be formal change very quickly, considering that they're also committing to renegotiating a Brexit deal. So not much bandwidth, you'd think, but I think it will embolden local authorities, particularly Labour authorities, who have been placing quite high demands on affordability and social rent as part of developers' commitments.
Yeah. So obviously infrastructure is another huge theme of their proposals. I mean, what did you pick up on that side of things?
So I think there's a strong theme of public ownership, public investment, and decarbonisation running through the whole infrastructure piece. And it's probably convenient to join environment or up with infrastructure in a way, because that's the way they seem to approach it. So a new climate and environment emergency bill where they're promising robust standards on decarbonisation, nature recovery, environmental quality and species protection. A new Clean Air Act, and interestingly they're saying that they will adopt the WHO standards for PM10 and nitrogen oxides, which are more onerous than the standards that are in our policy and
that we're not yet complying with.
Yeah, exactly. A big point on flood defences, 6 billion plus investment into those, and linked to that a review of planning guidance on flooding. A new environmental tribunal, which will be charged with testing administrative decisions to ensure they've been taken in accordance with environmental and nature recovery obligations in that legislation that they're proposing. On energy, they're committing to 90% of all electricity and 50% of all heat from renewable low-carbon sources by 2030. And in that commitment, there is some support for new nuclear power, where it's needed for security, onshore and offshore wind and tidal energy, but a ban on fracking. Maybe just touching on transport.
Yes,
quickly.
let's.
So public ownership, a big issue there. They're committed to public ownership of bus routes and railways. The investment that they've highlighted, quite significant, but the schemes they mention are Crossrail for the north and completing full HS2 up to Scotland.
Anything about Crossrail 2?
I couldn't see it actually, but perhaps they're leaving that for the Mayor's manifesto. No mention of garden cities for a change, but there is a mention of joining up transport and land use planning to create towns and cities which are healthy and encourage walking and cycling. And then on airports, surprisingly, really just the status quo, aligning themselves with the Davis Commission report and having those tests on air quality, noise and climate change. So that's a wrap.
It's amazing to have got through all of that. You've heard everything that there is. There's a lot to discuss here. And we're going to have the Conservative manifesto, I think, published later today, so no doubt we'll be back in a couple of days to cover that. But I hope you found that very interesting. Thank you.